Crisis is not a problem to be solved. Crisis is an opportunity to be seized. This is the single most important distinction between how ordinary people experience catastrophe and how the ultra-rich experience it. When a crisis hits, a financial collapse, a pandemic, a war, a political emergency, a social rupture, ordinary people experience it as a disaster, something to survive, something to endure, something to get through and then recover from. The ultra-rich experience the same event as a window, a temporary opening in the normal rules of society through which it is possible to push changes that would be impossible in stable times, to acquire assets at prices that only exist in the chaos, to concentrate power that was previously distributed, to install systems of control that populations would never accept in ordinary circumstances, but will embrace, even demand, when they are frightened enough. The billionaire class did not invent this understanding. It is as old as organized power. Machiavelli understood it. The Roman emperors understood it. Every major consolidation of wealth and power in human history has been associated with a crisis, real or manufactured, that created the conditions for consolidation that stability would never have allowed. What the modern ultra-rich have done is professionalize and systematize this understanding to a degree that previous eras could not have imagined. They have built entire institutions dedicated to monitoring crisis conditions and positioning capital for maximum extraction during the window of opportunity that crisis creates. They have developed sophisticated relationships with political systems that allow them to shape crisis response in ways that serve their interests while appearing to serve the public. And they have mastered the psychological management of frightened populations with a precision that turns mass fear into mass compliance on a timeline of their choosing. Understanding this is not comfortable, but not understanding it is more dangerous. In 2007, Naomi Klein published a book called The Shock Doctrine that described a pattern she had observed across decades of economic and political crises around the world. The pattern was consistent. A crisis occurred, or was allowed to occur, or in some cases was deliberately created. In the immediate aftermath, while the population was disoriented, grieving, and desperate for stability, economic and political changes were rapidly implemented that transferred enormous wealth and power to a small number of actors. By the time the population had recovered enough to evaluate what had happened, the changes were entrenched and effectively irreversible. Klein called it disaster capitalism. The ultra-rich call it opportunity. The psychological mechanism that makes this possible is well understood by behavioral scientists. Crisis disrupts the cognitive frameworks through which people normally evaluate the world. When your reference points are destroyed, when the job is gone, the savings are wiped out, the institutions you trusted have failed, you become desperate for new reference points, for anything that feels stable in the instability, for anyone who projects confidence in the chaos, for any framework that promises to make the disorder comprehensible and eventually resolved. This psychological state, desperate, disoriented, seeking stability, is exactly the state in which people accept things they would never accept when they feel secure. It is the state in which they surrender freedoms they would normally defend fiercely in exchange for the feeling of protection, in which they agree to economic terms they would normally reject because the alternative appears to be something worse, in which they hand power to whoever projects the most confident vision of order restored. The ultra-rich understand this with clinical precision. They have studied it. They have planned for it. And when the crisis arrives, whatever form it takes, they are positioned to offer exactly the stability that frightened populations are willing to pay any price to obtain. The most important work of crisis exploitation does not happen during the crisis. It happens before. The ultra-rich maintain what amount to permanent crisis preparation offices, teams of economists, political analysts, risk managers, and intelligence specialists whose function is to monitor for approaching crisis conditions and position capital and influence optimally before the crisis fully materializes. When ordinary people are still living in the comfortable certainty that the current stability will continue, these teams are already mapping the crisis landscape and establishing positions that will pay maximum returns when the disruption arrives. This is why the ultra-rich consistently emerge from crises wealthier than they entered them, while everyone else consistently emerges poorer. It is not luck. It is not superior resilience. It is preparation that began when no one else could see what was coming, and in some cases, when the people who could see it were among those who ensured it would come. Warren Buffett is the publicly acceptable face of this principle. He famously articulates the strategy as being greedy when others are fearful and fearful when others are greedy. What this means in practice is that he accumulates cash reserves during periods of optimism, when assets are expensive, and deploys those reserves during crisis, when assets are cheap. In 2008, when the financial system was collapsing and ordinary investors were selling everything in panic, Buffett was buying. Not because he was braver or more principled, because he had prepared for exactly this window and was positioned to exploit it. The less publicly discussed version of this principle is darker, because preparation for crisis sometimes shades into preparation that helps ensure the crisis happens, or happens in a form most beneficial to those already positioned to exploit it. The line between anticipating a crisis and engineering one is thinner than anyone with power will ever publicly acknowledge. George Soros built a significant portion of his fortune on a single trade that required him to understand that the British pound was in an unsustainable position, and then to apply enough pressure to the system to ensure that the unsustainability manifested in the way and on the timeline most beneficial to his position. He did not cause the structural weakness in the pound, but he identified it, positioned himself around it, and then pushed. The crisis that made him $1 billion in a single day was not entirely his creation, but it was not entirely natural either. During a crisis, whoever controls the explanation of the crisis controls the response to the crisis. And whoever controls the response to the crisis determines who pays the cost of the crisis and who collects its benefits. This is why the ultra-rich invest so heavily in narrative infrastructure, media ownership, think tank funding, political relationships, public intellectual networks during normal times. Because in normal times, narrative control produces marginal advantages. But during a crisis, narrative control produces transformational ones. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, two narratives were possible. The first was that the crisis was caused by the reckless behavior of a small number of financial institutions that had gambled with other people's money in pursuit of enormous personal profits, and that the appropriate response was to allow those institutions to fail, prosecute the individuals responsible, and restructure the financial system to prevent recurrence. The second narrative was that the financial system was too interconnected to allow any part of it to fail, that the crisis was a natural systemic event rather than the product of deliberate choices, and that the appropriate response was to provide government funds to stabilize the institutions at the center of the crisis. The first narrative would have resulted in significant financial losses for the ultra-rich who owned those institutions. The second narrative resulted in those institutions being rescued with public money, while the executives responsible retained their positions and their bonuses. The second narrative won, not because it was more accurate, because the people who controlled the narrative infrastructure, who owned the media, funded the think tanks, staffed the advisory positions in government, and had decades of relationships with the political figures making the decisions, were the same people who benefited from the second narrative prevailing. The population experienced this as a natural response to a natural disaster. The ultra-rich experienced it as the system working exactly as designed. Every crisis produces distressed assets, and distressed assets are the most reliable source of extraordinary returns in the history of capitalism. When a financial crisis eliminates the savings of ordinary households and small businesses, those households and businesses are forced to sell assets, homes, businesses, equipment, real estate, at prices that reflect their desperation rather than the underlying value of what they're selling. The buyers of those assets are not experiencing the same desperation. They have liquid capital reserves, accumulated precisely for this opportunity, and they are able to purchase at prices that will generate enormous returns when stability eventually returns. This is not a side effect of crisis. For the ultra-rich who are properly positioned, it is the primary financial event of the decade. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, institutional investors and private equity firms purchased millions of foreclosed homes from families who had lost them at prices that reflected the depth of the crisis. When the housing market recovered, those same properties were worth multiples of the crisis purchase price. The families who had lost them did not participate in that recovery. The wealth was permanently transferred during the crisis window and never returned. John Paulson, the hedge fund manager, made $20 billion in 2007 by positioning his fund to profit from the collapse of the housing market. He understood before almost anyone else what was building in the mortgage market, positioned his fund to benefit from the collapse, and collected returns of historic magnitude, while the families whose mortgages were packaged into the instruments he was betting against lost their homes. This is the acquisition machine at its most undisguised. The crisis was real. The suffering was real. The families who lost their homes were not participants in a financial abstraction. And at the same time, the extraction of wealth from that suffering into the hands of those positioned to exploit it was systematic, deliberate, and operating entirely within the legal frameworks that the ultra-rich had helped write. Normal legislative processes are slow. Proposals are debated. Opposition organizes. Public scrutiny builds. Interests are represented. Compromises are made. The deliberate slowness of normal democratic process is a feature. It allows time for the full implications of proposed changes to be understood and contested. Crisis collapses that timeline completely. When a genuine emergency exists, or when a situation can be successfully framed as one, the normal checks on legislative power are suspended in favor of speed. Emergency authorization, executive orders, fast-tracked legislation that bypasses normal committee processes and public comment periods. The justification is always the same. The situation is too urgent for normal deliberation. We must act now. The cost of delay is catastrophic. The ultra-rich understand this dynamic with perfect clarity. They maintain legislative wish lists, policy changes, regulatory modifications, tax provisions, legal frameworks that they know cannot survive normal democratic scrutiny. These proposals sit in waiting, ready to be inserted into emergency legislation when the crisis window opens. The 2001 Patriot Act was drafted with remarkable speed for a piece of legislation of its complexity. The 2008 bank bailout legislation was 3 pages long when first proposed, a document that would have transferred almost unlimited financial authority to the Treasury Secretary with essentially no oversight. The emergency COVID stimulus packages contained provisions that had nothing to do with pandemic response and everything to do with the interests of specific industries, that had spent years failing to pass those provisions through normal channels. Each crisis is different. The legislative insertions are consistent. The window of emergency provides cover for changes that would never survive public examination in stable times. And by the time stability returns and examination becomes possible, the changes are law. The ultra-rich do not just exploit fear, they manage it. And the management of fear during crisis is one of the most sophisticated psychological operations in the modern world. The optimal fear level for social control is neither too low nor too high. Too low, and the population feels secure enough to question, resist, and demand accountability. Too high, and the population becomes completely paralyzed, unable to function as workers or consumers or voters in the ways the system requires. The optimal fear level is elevated but managed, high enough to make the population compliant and grateful for protection, low enough that they continue to function in the roles the system needs them to fill. This management of fear during crisis is not left to chance. It is actively shaped through the media infrastructure that the ultra-rich own and fund, through the political messaging that their contributions influence, through the expert voices that their institutional funding elevates, and through the suppression of alternative framings that might produce a different emotional response to the same objective situation. During the 2008 financial crisis, the phrase "too big to fail" was introduced into public discourse and repeated relentlessly by political figures, media commentators, and financial experts. The phrase did specific psychological work. It framed the rescue of the ultra-rich institutions not as a political choice, but as a physical necessity. Not as something that could have been done differently, but as the only response to an objective reality. It manufactured consent for a massive transfer of public wealth to private hands, by making that transfer appear to be a law of nature, rather than a decision made by people with interests. The management of fear during crisis always follows this pattern. The objective situation is real. The suffering is real. The urgency is real. And woven through all of that genuine reality is a carefully constructed narrative that channels the fear response in directions that happen to serve the interests of those doing the constructing. Here is the final mechanism that makes crisis exploitation complete and self-perpetuating. The recovery from every major crisis returns the economy to growth. Asset prices recover. Employment recovers. GDP recovers. The official numbers tell a story of restoration. But the recovery does not restore what was lost at the bottom. It restores what was accumulated at the top. The homes purchased at crisis prices by institutional investors appreciate back to and beyond pre-crisis values. Those gains belong to the institutions. The families who lost the homes in the crisis do not participate in the recovery of the asset they lost. The wealth is gone permanently. The businesses bought at crisis prices by private equity appreciate as the economy recovers. The workers who lost their jobs when those businesses failed do not participate in that appreciation. They find new employment at wages shaped by the power dynamics that the crisis reinforced. The legislative changes inserted during the emergency window remain in place. The regulatory rollbacks remain rolled back. The tax provisions remain operational. The ordinary scrutiny that would have prevented these changes in normal times was never applied during the emergency. And by the time normal times return, the changes are established facts rather than proposals subject to debate. This is why crisis after crisis produces the same result. The ultra-rich enter each one prepared. They acquire during the chaos. They shape the narrative and the response. They insert their legislative priorities into the emergency window, and they exit with a larger share of everything: assets, political power, regulatory advantage than they had when the crisis began. The ordinary person emerges having survived, having endured, perhaps having recovered to something approaching their pre-crisis position. But the gap between where they stand and where the ultra-rich stand is wider than it was before the crisis. And the systems that produce that gap have been quietly reinforced during the emergency, while everyone was looking at the emergency. Understanding crisis exploitation does not make you immune to it. The next crisis will still be disorienting. The fear will still be real. The urgency will still compress your thinking. You will still feel the pull toward whoever projects stability in the chaos. But understanding it changes your relationship to the narrative that surrounds each crisis. When the next crisis arrives, and it will arrive, and the media is telling you what it means and who is responsible and what must be done immediately, ask who benefits from that framing. When emergency legislation is fast-tracked and you're told there is no time for scrutiny, ask what is in the legislation that wouldn't survive scrutiny. When assets are being transferred at crisis prices, ask who has the liquid capital to buy and how long they have been holding it in preparation for exactly this moment. The crisis is real. The suffering is real. And running alongside the genuine catastrophe every single time is a deliberate and sophisticated operation to convert that catastrophe into the greatest wealth transfer of the generation. The people running that operation are counting on you to be too frightened and too exhausted and too focused on survival to notice what is happening beside you while you survive. Notice it anyway, because the crisis they are exploiting may be the one they told you to be afraid of, or it may be the one they arranged for you to be afraid of. And knowing the difference starts with knowing the pattern. Now you know the pattern.